Hello and welcome to Chapter 2, Sources of Information and Why Research is Our Best Tool. If you remember from Chapter 1, the basic focus there was on what's the nature of science, how do we apply scientific methodology to social science research, specifically psychology, what we mean by good theory, hypothesis, these kinds of things. So basic definitions and notions of why science is our important way of gathering information. Today we're going to be talking about sources of information, kind of recognizing that the pursuit of scientific information is embedded amongst many other ways of coming up with ideas about how the world works. And those ideas on how the world works are promulgated in a variety of ways on how we can get access to the best sources of information. Our sources of information are our beliefs or the beliefs of others, which come from experiences we've had, intuitions that we may imagine, and authority that we may carry or we may see in others. Our gold standard, however, is empirical research. That is, research that is generated from objective observations about the world in a systematic fashion. So let's talk about experience as one way of obtaining beliefs. It seems like a good one, and it is actually the basis for proper empirical research. That is to say, we're making observations, and that is a kind of experience. But the difference between our everyday experience and the experience that we're talking about in scientific research is the experiences in scientific research are systematically organized and carefully managed so that we do not lead ourselves astray. There are problems with our everyday experiences being the basis for our judgments about how the world works. One of the main ones is that there's no comparison group, and we'll see in a few moments what we mean by that, but generally it is, well, so you've made these observations or had these experiences yourself, but how do other people respond that are maybe getting a different version of what you experienced? What does that mean and imply, therefore, about the process that you believe is going on? And the other one is confounding, or confounded is a problem with, being confounded is a problem with empirical research. That is to say, there's always some other things going on that you may or may not be aware of that could actually be the cause of whatever you are observing or things going on. So when we talk about comparison groups, we're going to use as an example energy drinks. This is an example that your book uses also. You may feel better after drinking an energy drink, and that's great. But the question is, would you feel, how does that compare to people's feelings after they're drinking something else? That is the unique supposed benefit of an energy drink really there, or is it any number of other things? After drinking something that doesn't have this special ingredient, do they also feel better in the same way? And we can make tests on that. I mean, this may be the graph of how much energetic feeling you say, or a group of people say, after drinking the energy drink, and we would say, wow, they have a feeling of 55, and we have no idea if that's good or bad, and that's the point. It seems like it's a number, it's even kind of a biggish number in the world of numbers, and so we go, wow, they have an energetic feeling. But how do we know how people would feel if they drank something else? And so if we compare that to people who drink a copycat, something that seems like it's the energy drink, tastes like the energy drink, but doesn't have that special ingredient that's supposed to be the energizing factor in the energy drink, we might see this data. We might see that 55 is validated as a genuine benefit of that ingredient. This could be the data that could come out. The copycat generates an energetic feeling of 20 on average in people, whereas the energy drink generates an average of 55. Could be. Or it could look like this. 55 versus 53. And that's probably not a real difference. That's probably not a difference that matters statistically or practically. That is, anything you drink could give you an energetic feeling. It even could be that the energy drink gives you lower energetic feeling than those drinking the copycat. And any of those are possible. And the only way to know which of these three outcomes is really going on in the world is to get some kind of comparison group that's drinking some other copycat that tastes the same, looks the same, but is missing that key thing that you think makes the energy drink particularly beneficial. So comparison groups are vital for making solid inferences about if something has an effect on something else. Can I say one thing causes another? So with systematic empirical research, we can make sure that we create good comparison groups, good comparison situations to then judge whether or not this supposed benefit is going on. Experience is also confounded. Whenever you have an experience, you can't know what really caused the outcome you experienced. Was it the sweetness? The fact that you stopped your work for a few minutes? The fact that you're socializing while you consume the energy drink? Or maybe that it really is the active ingredient that's responsible for you feeling energized. This thing they say, the promoted active ingredient, is responsible. You can't know because all those things are part of the energy drink. And the fact that you can't separate those out based on simply experience means that they are confounds. Any of them could be responsible. You don't know without doing proper empirical research. Confounds are anything that may be varying along with what you're experiencing. Therefore, may be the actual cause of your experience. And systematic research can eliminate the confounds. You can have a group drink the energy drink alone, pausing from work, alone while they continue to work, with others, and all of the above conditions of alone, pausing, alone, continuing, and with others, with a copycat that doesn't have the special ingredient. You can then examine the energetic feeling that is on average displayed by people in each of these 6 described groups to see which ones do you see the feeling energized most represented. And maybe they all look similar, or maybe some of them look good. Maybe it's with others, but it's with others both with a copycat and with the energy drink, in which case you would be able to reasonably conclude that it has nothing to do with the drink. It has to do with the socializing, making you feel more energized. Intuition. We are very skilled at constructing explanations in our mind, ideas that seem very sensible. And this is a good thing because often we are able to imagine what might be an interesting experimental outcome, and so it can also be a basis for doing good research. Some research is done, in fact, as thought experiments and done very well, but it's the start of understanding, not the end. There are all kinds of cognitive processing errors, biases, and heuristics that can cause problems that lead our intuitive thinking astray. And I want to say that thought experiments are valuable, that using our intuition and our thinking and our ideas before we plunge into research is valuable. Some of the most famous psychologists that have found some very, very interesting things about how we make judgments and decisions, Tversky and Kahneman, they revealed that one of their fundamental ideas in their research as they developed a new project to study is, can they really imagine themselves falling victim to the kinds of decision-making errors they were studying? And only if they could figure out when and how they might themselves fall victim, that they then start pursuing a research agenda to try to figure out whether or not it really happened and how it happened. And so it's pretty reasonable to use thinking to start your research, but always you're only going to discover your truths about processes using our empirical scientific method. One of the problems with intuition is what we refer to as the availability heuristic. This is an error that leads us to overestimate things that are more easily brought from memory. They're more available. They usually are very vivid or unusual or personal. And so we cannot help but more easily grasp them and therefore elevate their importance, their size, their magnitude, their ranking, whatever it is that it may be about them, we tend to make more, bigger, better. There's also something called the present bias. This is treating information as if only the information that we see and have available to us is important, and ignoring absence of information as meaningful. If it has a connection to the lack of comparison group, because the comparison group will expose what an absence of events looks like. The book has an excellent example of the importance of attending to the absence of information and the description of Sherlock Holmes noting the absence of a dog's bark, suggesting something very important about the characteristics of a person they were suspecting in a crime. Intuition also has the tendency to lead us into the confirmation bias. This is a tendency to only pay attention to evidence that supports our previously held beliefs. It is analogous to confirmatory hypothesis testing. That is, our tendency to ask questions that are based upon already expected outcomes and confirm it rather than disconfirm it. We're seeking only to get answers to questions that people will say yes to, and we're not so interested in asking neutral questions that people can respond either way to, or questions that could actually disconfirm our expectations. They're harder for us to think of, and so we tend not to go there. We tend to think, I think what I'm dealing with here is a horse. It could be a zebra. All you heard were hoof sounds. And in a sense, horses are more common and you ought to be looking for them. But if you ask a question about, well, did it have stripes? You've definitely eliminated zebras from your consideration, even though you're more likely to ask, did it have a mane and tail, which would actually apply to both of them. People tend to be biased about their biases also. This has the intriguing name, the bias blind spot. That is, we don't notice that we ourselves have cognitive biases that inhibit our being accurate in our thinking and fair in our thinking and neutral in our thinking. It's the kind of statement we might make, about hearing about confirmation bias and availability heuristic while you've been reading in the book, and almost certainly being, well, that doesn't apply to me. I'm sure that's true of Joe and Susie, but not me. I'm scrupulously neutral and fair. And I'm sure you feel that way. But this is the bias blind spot occurring when we imagine that we are not subject to the same kinds of heuristics and biases that frankly we all are, if we're not very, very careful and systematic in our recording of information. So empirical research trumps intuition. It beats it because we're doing systematic organization of our observations. We cannot ignore absence of information. All of the information, not just the most easily noticed or confirming, is reported. Actual data is recorded, not mere imagining of data. So all of those things that are potential flaws of intuition are managed by a systematic recording of observations. We also have authorities as a potential source for information. And this is a bit of a tough one, because it asks us to determine if an authority is really a top scholar, really knows his or her stuff, and is therefore correct. Even the reference to research is a kind of relying on authority that can be faulty, because not all research is of good quality. Therefore, one of the main things we're attempting to learn in this class, the textbook's key orientation, is to teach you how to get a handle on the quality of research. And that actually implies something about the quality of an authority. The authority of this documented research, but also the authority of a person standing in front of you saying that they know the truth about something. So our gold standard, as I said earlier, is, and I've repeated several times before, empirical research. Gold standard is a phrase that means the best. Empirical research is our gold standard for discovering how the world works, how and why people think and behave the way they do for psychologists. There are many kinds of research. Some can answer questions well, some poorly, and finding the previously done research is critical to us not reinventing the wheel and moving forward. The key to this course, or the main point of this course, is to learn how to construct research studies that can answer the question you intend to answer, to try to answer. One of the first steps you've got to do is read the literature of what's been done before, so you're not doing a study that's already been done. Why should you do a study that's already been done? Usually replication also involves extension. We don't tend to do as much pure replication as we ought to in the social sciences. We tend to do replication and extensions as a combined factor, and some are questioning whether or not that's a proper thing for us to do. There is some legitimate debate right now about how social sciences do their work, particularly when it comes to replication. But right now it's about how do we find the research, how do we get what we want. If empirical research is the gold standard, we have to find it, read it, and interrogate it. That is, investigate whether or not this is a good study, to know how good it is, how it applies to our situation. Researchers present their findings, as we've mentioned before, at conferences, but the stuff that's presented at conferences is frankly difficult to get copies of if you don't go to the conference. If you weren't there, you're going to have a hard time getting it. In journal articles and books, it's easier to get these if you have good library access. That means most academic libraries, if they don't have it at their own library, they can get it through what's called interlibrary loan. And we have a very good interlibrary loan system that's associated with the Frostburg State University campus, links us with libraries all over the world. And if our library does not have a particular article or a particular book, it can usually be acquired for you. For articles, usually in electronic format within days. For books, it can take a couple of weeks or so. Now, when we're talking about journal articles, there's really two main types: empirical and review articles. Empirical articles and review articles. Empirical articles report on the findings from empirical research, how the data was collected, how the statistical analyses were done, and what these findings may mean. Review articles provide an overview of the current state of research on a topic. And there's two main kinds of review articles. There's a narrative review article. This is kind of a classic that's been around for 100 years or more, which you discuss trends and gaps in the findings. What is the basic collection of everything we know about this topic and our current state of understanding about it. Meta-analysis is a relatively more recently developed technique over the last 20 or 30 years, which does a statistical combination of the findings from a whole bunch of studies to show trends and gaps. Bring all these studies together, figure out certain statistical properties from each one, and use some extremely complex statistics, honestly, to combine them. I've worked on a couple of meta-analyses. They're hard. They're really hard. But they're very revealing as well. Books are another place that you'll see research published. They can be chapters of the book. Usually that's comparable to a review article. Or whole books written to pull together many related topics that have a common theme, issues or underlying principles that the book has as its main topic. So how do you go about finding these sources? Well, of course, the library is your friend. It's so much easier now to use due to online access and databases. It used to be if you wanted to get something out of the library, you had to go to the library. You had to physically walk up to a catalog file box that was dozens and dozens of small index cards that had all the details, and books that were published that indexed everything to help you find things. You would look for where the article had been published, where has it been cited, what journals was it in, then go to find what holdings the library had of that particular journal. It was all very paper driven and extremely time consuming. Now it's much, much, much easier. I can do searching of the databases in my pajamas at home watching a soccer match, and get not quite as efficient, but I can get what I need for developing some ideas. PsycInfo is the main, but not the only, but the main database of psychology related articles, books, book chapters, books, and so forth. That is where you find psychology publications. In fact, our second APA activity, the one you'll be doing this week, is on using PsycInfo at the FSU library. Google Scholar is emerging as a solid database for finding scholarly research. But we will not use Google Scholar in this class. But you should be aware of it, because it's probably the future of databasing and indexing articles. This is the URL for it, and there's also pages for individuals who's published research. There's the URL for my page. I have a page on Google Scholar. It existed before I went to look for it, which is kind of typical of Google stuff, but it wasn't public until I acknowledged it was mine and did a little bit of editing of it, because they tried to include some articles that were not mine and it missed some articles that were mine. And so after I did a little bit of work on it, I was able to get it to where it was appropriate for it to be seen by other persons. So how do we go about reading these things? It's not easy. These articles are dense with information, and they're not written for everyday folks to read. They're written, frankly, for other scholars in the field to read. And so they tend to have a lot of jargon in them, a lot of difficult writing, a lot of difficult statistics. How do you go about reading empirical articles? Well, the first thing to look at is the abstract. That's where the article's generally overviewed. Then there's a body to the paper. This is true of all papers, and it has these particular subsections. The introduction usually has no heading. It kind of introduces the topic, the method, how the data was collected, and the results, how the data analysis went, and a discussion. What does it all mean? Those are the basic structural elements. There are more complex versions of these. Many papers have multiple studies described in them, and as such will have multiple method, results, and discussion sections. There will be an overall discussion section. It can get pretty complicated, but the basic structure of intro, method, results, discussion is embedded within empirical articles at some level. On occasion, results and discussion are combined. And then there's a references section. That's where you put all the sources you used. So what is an abstract? An abstract is a brief summary of the entire article. Indeed, it may be the only thing that people read about your article for 90% of the folks who see it at all. It's not an introduction to the article. This is one of the most important concepts. If you read abstracts, you'll get that sense of them. So you should read abstract after abstract after abstract to get the sense of they're not really introductions to the article. They're indicating what's the perspective that was taken, what's the hypotheses that were tested, what's the method that was used, and what are the major findings. And each of these things is told in only one or two sentences. You only have 120 words to give an overview description of the entire article. And so you want to point out what are the main top line key things that someone ought to understand. The only nuances should be there if the nuances actually were the main finding in the end. That's the most interesting thing in the article. The idea is that someone can read the abstract and then decide from it if the article itself is worth reading in detail. This is about the topic I'm interested in. I find the findings actually communicate to what I'm building as an idea, so I need to read the whole article to see what and how they did it, so I can know if it's really trustworthy, because that's key. Introduction has answers to these questions. What is the topic? What theories apply to this topic? So if we're going to be researching how fast people walk in various types of weather, we probably want to find out what theories do we know about how people decide to walk, the speeds they walk. What has been found already? What other studies of walking have been done? And then what does that leave us for specific hypotheses that we're going to gather data about for this study? The method is a description of how the data was gathered, who or what was observed, the people or the objects that were noted and form a collection of data because we observed one or several things about those people or objects. And then how was it observed, manipulated, measured? What did we do with people? How did we create different situations for them, different experiences for them? And how did we measure what we intended to measure about them? And then we get to data analysis, which is in the results section. Quantitative and qualitative examination fundamentally to determine if our hypotheses are supported or not based upon the data that was gathered using the methods that were described in the methods section. We are doing an examination of various checks and properties of the measurement system as well, often, to determine did the measurement system work properly. Because measurement in psychology is not just a matter of holding a ruler up and saying something is so many inches long. We have to be more careful that when we assert something as measuring narcissism or anxiety, that we have some confidence that it really is measuring those things. Then we get to the discussion. That's where we explicitly describe to what extent the hypotheses were supported or not supported by the data analysis. While that may be implied in the results section, you review it again here in very explicit terms. Which hypotheses were supported and which ones were not supported. And then you go on to what are the contributions from research? What do we know more about that we didn't know before this study was done? How has this study expanded our state of knowledge on the topic? And then what are the limits? What are alternative explanations, alternative findings, that are alternative explanations for what we found in the study? And this is very important. You will not see limitations pointed out that could not be an alternative explanation. If you have findings that are all statistically significant, there's no point in saying anything about small sample size. It simply doesn't matter. It's not an issue. If you want to say something about, well, we could have had a problem with random assignment and people weren't really, the three groups that we created weren't really roughly similar to each other. Well, unless you have evidence for that, and you have some kind of failure in the study, you really don't have any reason to be saying that kind of thing. You need to have things that really genuinely alternatively explain the findings in your limitations. Not just, gosh, this could have happened. Yes, almost anything could have happened. A crater could have opened up from underneath the building you were doing the work in, and that would have had a big effect upon the accuracy of your results. But it didn't. Therefore, it's not worth talking about or speculating upon. In a way that gets into we don't really talk about our intuitions much. And then you get into what interesting future ideas for research does this lead to. And this is usually in terms of, well, if this is true, then that implies this next thing should be true also. Or if you have some limitation in your study that's legitimate, and there are many legitimate limitations in our studies, then a new study that will address one of those limitations is also good to mention in this portion of the discussion. Finally, you conclude with a references section, which is all the sources of information used in the paper. For every citation in your paper, there must be a reference, and for every reference entry that you have at the end of the paper, there must be a place where it is cited in the paper. There are some journals that have some exceptions to these rules that are very minor. For the most part, this is your guideline, especially for this class. Oh, those are the sections. That's the basic structure for a paper. But how do you go about reading a paper? You got to read it several times. You want to focus on the individual sections and trying to answer the questions that those sections offer to you. You first want to read the introduction to just get a sense of what's their argument, what's their perspective that supports their hypothesis, and what are the hypotheses. And so, you don't have it's a good idea just to kind of go through and first just read the headings of the paper and then read the first sentences of every paragraph and then read it in more detail. And make sure I actually sometimes often will just skip down to the hypothesis first and then go back and read, because I'm actually kind of believe that it helps me to follow their logic if I know where they're heading for it. And most papers are not written that way. I personally believe the hypothesis in a very brief and fundamental form ought to be stated in the first paragraph of the paper, but that's my personal prejudice for style of writing. I think it helps the reader to know where you're going. There's an old rule about writing that goes, tell them where you're going, tell them where you've been. The idea is don't leave them in doubt about what journey they're on in your paper. And I believe that we do well to start off with an overview of our logic and a brief version of our hypothesis in the very opening of the paper. Your author of your textbook has a different opinion about how the opening of a paper ought to go. So how do we read a paper? Further, the methods and results sections. What are we supposed to be getting out of that? Well, this is where we really find out if we can trust the findings. Even if the theoretical rationale is not great, even if the hypotheses really don't follow that nicely from the theoretical rationale, the fact of the matter is, if they had a solid method and did good data analysis, then those other things are kind of secondary in a way. They're important, they're vital to be able to construct a fully useful paper. But you nevertheless only can know that you can trust the data if it was collected well and analyzed well. And so this is where you're going to have the real evidence for did they do a good job in this paper or not, or in this study. The first paragraphs of the discussion are also where you find if they have evidence for support of their hypotheses. Now, the fact of the matter is, these academic papers are not read by very many people. When you go and look at my Google page, if you go to see it, you'll see that my most cited paper has been cited a couple of hundred times. It's probably been read by less than 5,000 people in the whole world. That's not a whole lot of people reading my paper. All of my papers put together have probably been read by probably less than 7,500 or 10,000 people in the whole world, which is not that many people reading stuff. So we have to have some humility about that, but also recognize that most people get their exposure to psychology research, and in fact scientific information in general, through more popular mass media methods. Research does in fact show up everywhere. On the book shelf in bricks or in online stores or bricks and mortar stores, Amazon, Barnes and Noble, the university bookstore, and so forth. You see a problem, particularly in psychology, where self-help books and scholarly books sit side by side, muddling for the public what are good and poor sources. Here we have a picture of a bookshelf. This is from your textbook, and it has two books that are very, very different in their underlying scholarly quality, side by side with each other. One of them is a book that your author talks about, the one that has a blue and red and gold gradiated pattern that says Healing ADD, the Breakthrough Program, etc., 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 with the 6 types of ADD, and your author has looked at this book and says there's no references in this book. It's a relatively unknown author. We really, what do we really have here? What is this basis for all the strong statements made in this book? Just a few books over is a book that I personally own, The Lucifer Effect by Philip Zimbardo. Now, this is a book about how basically good people engage in bad acts. And he wrote even though the research upon which this is based dates back to the 70s, it fundamentally is based upon the Stanford prison experiment. And nevertheless, there's been many, many studies done since that clarify, find nuance, and otherwise help us understand how situations can drive otherwise completely normal, happy, healthy, and positive people into doing very, very, very terrible acts. He was prompted to write this book after serving as a consultant in the courts-martial cases against the guards who worked at the Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq, where some terrible acts of torture and mistreatment were conducted against prisoners. Zimbardo is a top scholar in general, and particularly in this field of research. There's 43 pages of references at the end of his book. I didn't count the number of references, but it's several hundred. Which one, just based upon that, is more likely to be the better book? Well, one that's got references, probably. That's not a guarantee, but it's a good. A book without references probably ought to be better thought of as a novel, fiction, maybe a good bathroom reader. It's probably not something you ought to use to really adjust your thinking about how the world works or how your life ought to be. A book with references may not be excellent, but at least you can look through the references to see what they look like. Are they from scholarly sources? Are these references scholarly sources? Or are they just other pop magazines and books? If they're just other pop magazines and books, you really don't have a solid collection of references. You've just got kind of an overview of what folks think about this, not good research. A commonly seen resource used by students, and I'm going to be honest, myself and many faculty, even though some of them won't admit it, is Wikipedia, or more generally wikis. There are other wikis besides Wikipedia. Wikipedia is just the one that's most well known. They're wonderful and they're awful. I'm a big fan, but I'm always aware that maybe what's there isn't right. It's real hit or miss for finding articles on scholarly topics. Some scholarly topics are excellently covered, and some, not so much. Some they just miss, it's not interesting enough, no one's bothered to write it, it's a very specialized area, etc., etc. This is being worked on, though. The Association for Psychological Science, one of the major science organizations for psychology, has started a few years ago a Wikipedia initiative. And the primary goal of it is to fill the gaps in psychological knowledge. And they've done a very good job. They encourage using it in the classroom. And I've done Wikipedia in classroom assignments. I found that there's good and bad in it also. It's a lot of work, but there's real value in it. One of the things students really learn is, hey, anyone can edit it, including you. And that's not a bad thing. That can be a very good thing. Honestly, 2 nights ago, I edited something in Wikipedia, and the week before I edited something. And then sometimes I may go several months before I edit anything, and then I may go through a flurry of doing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 edits. It depends on my mood, depends on if I see something I feel like needs to be edited. Often it's just typos or adding a little simple information, but sometimes it's extensive. It depends on how much I know about the topic and how confident I feel about writing about it. And if I'm wrong, there's always someone out there who will figure it out. That's the thing. Wikipedia is surprisingly accurate. It's been found to be as accurate as standard encyclopedias, even with the flaws and the fact that laypersons can edit it. And that right there is a real selling point for me. We may think and imagine that we can just trust encyclopedias, and we do, and we should. But the fact of the matter is, even standard encyclopedias like the World Book and Encyclopedia Britannica have errors. They make mistakes. Human beings, whatever human beings put together, can and will have errors in it. One of the things about Wikipedia, though, is that errors persist for a short period of time. The median time is a handful of minutes. If I remember correctly, I haven't looked at this article in a while. I think it's like 4 minutes. 4 minutes for an error to get fixed. And it's probably quicker than that because they have more robots working on that kind of thing now. So we can trust Wikipedia, but verify. Look at the recent edits page to see if there's been vandalism or changes that look suspect. And just, does it pass the sniff test? Does it really seem to make sense based upon what you've learned? So in conclusion, what we've learned today is to discuss the importance of empirical research as a tool for understanding the world, and to be exposed to how to find and read high-quality research. We have an upcoming assignment on APA for using PsycInfo and library resources, and that will be later on in the week. Thank you for your attention. I'll see you next lecture. Bye.